I wanted to ask you about, in your new book, you talk about the whole issue of class and race and the relationship of capitalism to race. And in one section of the book, you write, anti-capitalism cannot eliminate class racism without anti-racism. And case in point, you mentioned, is the persistent racism Afro-Cubans faced in socialist Cuba after the revolution of 1959. Give us a better sense of how you see this whole interrelationship between the fight against racism and also against capitalism.
Well, I think it's interrelated. I mean, I classify racism and capitalism as these conjoined twins, right? From the same body, but different personalities, different faces. And the reason why I do that is because I'm an historian. And so I track, particularly in my last book, the origins of racism cannot be separated from the origins of capitalism. The origins of capitalism cannot be separated from the origins of racism. The life of racism cannot be separated from the life of capitalism, and vice versa. When you think about, for instance, the slave trade, which was critical in the accumulation of wealth in Europe, that was fundamentally a set of racist policies. When you think of colonialism or even slavery, these are fundamentally a relationship between racism and capitalism, which was essential to its emergence. And so I think in order to truly be anti-racist, you also have to truly be anti-capitalist, as I write in the book. And in order to truly be anti-capitalist, you have to be anti-racist, because they're interrelated.
So talk more about this and the founding of this country and the issue of slavery, the number of presidents who had slaves, and president who had the most slaves of all, Thomas Jefferson, something like, what, 600 slaves?
Yeah, I mean,
lay that all out.
When you look at the founding of this country, you're really talking about the power, American power at its founding, largely being held in the hands of slaveholders. You're talking about slaveholders who largely shaped economic policy that they ensured did not eliminate or harm racial policy, which was key to, of course, their slaveholding. You're also talking about a group of people and slaveholders who, by 1860, became the richest group of people in the world. And slaves and the crops that they were producing and the land that they were producing those crops on were essentially the wealth of America. These were, when you talk about how America became rich, you can't separate America's riches from slavery. And the reason why America was able to become rich through slavery, which was an economic system, was because of racism. So that's why you can't really separate the two. And I know many people want to, but I mean, we have to stare truth in the face.
Continuing in that vein, for the first time, I think, in a presidential race, the issue of reparations has now been addressed by several of the Democratic candidates, whereas previously had been largely an issue among activists in the African American and Latino community. I'm wondering your perspective of how this is now finally surfacing and the resistance against it.
Well, I think it's obviously surfacing because of those activists, right? And because of their voices and because of their activism. And I would say to my fellow Americans who oppose reparations, you know, I would ask the question, currently, well, first I'd make the statement that currently the white median wealth in this country is 10 times higher than black median wealth. And then forecasters are estimating that by 2050, black median wealth will be at $0. And they're forecasting that 2 decades later, that Latino median wealth will be at $0. So what we're seeing now is a growing racial wealth gap. How do we stop this growing racial wealth gap, turn it around, even close it without reparations? Because the reason for that racial wealth gap is because of past and present racist policies. And so reparations is not only a way to challenge and eliminate those policies, but also to essentially repair the effects of those policies, which is the racial wealth gap.
Let's turn to 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Senator Cory Booker, this is Booker speaking on ABC's This Week.
This impudent simplicity of who is and who isn't a racist is really not the question. If we have racism in our country and we are all in this together and we believe that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, what are you doing about that injustice? It's not enough to say I'm not a racist in America. If racism exists, you need to be anti-racist.
So let's go to this issue, and that's the core of your book, Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. The idea that to be a non-racist and to be an anti-racist are very different.
They are. And when we really sort of acknowledge the term not racist, we're really thinking about a term that comes from the larger sentence, I'm not racist. And then when we think of who and when are people saying, I am not racist, they're typically saying that when what? They're being charged with being racist for something they said or did. And this is Americans across the ideological board. But the people who first and most prominently would say that they're not racist were eugenicists, right? Were Jim Crow segregationists. White nationalists and supremacists today are saying no matter what policies they support, no matter what ideas they express, that they are not racist. They can say that Latinx people are invading this country. They can say that this black neighborhood is an infestation, and then they can turn around and say, I'm the least racist person anywhere in the world. And what that means to me is that the term not racist, that when we say I'm not racist, that is fundamentally a term of denial. That's all it has really ever been. It has never really had any meaning other than a way for one to deny being racist when charged with being racist. In contrast, being anti-racist, there's a clear sense of what that is. If a racist says that certain racial groups are superior or inferior or better or worse than others, an anti-racist says there's nothing wrong or even right with any racial groups. We're equals. If a racist supports policies through their action or even inaction, as Senator Booker stated, then they're being a racist because they're allowing for the reproduction of racial inequities. If someone is supporting policies with their actions that create racial equity, they're being an anti-racist.
You also delve in your new book on the how racism has affected the African American and Latino communities, the issue of skin color and lighter and darker. I wonder if you could talk about that as well as your own personal journey through that maelstrom of trying to understand how race works in America.
Sure. So How to Be an Anti-Racist was very difficult for me to write because I had so many personal stories. And one of the personal stories, and I don't want to say this, but I'm going to have to say it, it's in the book, so people are going to read it, is when I was in college, I thought that my eyes were too dark. And so I decided to get color contacts. And they were these honey contacts. And my friends would joke on me that I had orange eyes. But I thought with these honey contacts that I was more beautiful, that I looked better, that I was more attractive. And this was a representation of what I sort of address in the book is known as colorism, right? This idea that the lighter the skin, the better. The lighter the eyes, the better. The straighter the hair, the better. And within communities of color, there are, of course, gradations of skin color, of eye color, of hair texture. And so what I did in that—
And it often changes from generation to generation.
Precisely. And what I did in that chapter of called Color was sort of talk about what I called light people and dark people. And this is particularly within communities of color. And we have been led to believe, primarily taught to people of color by white people who said, since lighter people are closer to us, they're more superior to those dark people. And we've internalized those ideas. And there's also a set of policies that actually favor lighter people over darker people. So I talked about all of the disparities between light people and dark people. And an anti-racist does not view lighter people or even darker people as better or worse than each other.
Which is the perfect time to bring in one of the great writers of the 20th century, Toni Morrison, who we just lost last week. Last week on Democracy Now! We did an hour, 2 hours, 1 hour on the show and 1 hour off with Nikki Giovanni and Angela Davis and Sonia Sanchez playing the clips of Toni Morrison. And we want to go back to one of those moments, as you describe, wanting lighter eyes, Ibram. Let's go to 2010. A conversation between Toni Morrison and Angela Davis at the New York Public Library.
When I wrote the first book I wrote, The Bluest Eye, I really wanted to know why that girl felt so bad. The one who, a real life girl, who said she wanted blue eyes. We were talking about whether God existed. I, of course, was persuaded that he did. And she was persuaded that he did not, and her proof was that she had prayed for blue eyes for 2 years. 2 years. And she didn't get them. So obviously he wasn't up there. But when I looked at her and thought about how awful she would look if she got them. And then I thought the second thing was how beautiful she was at that moment, you know. She was just incredible, but I didn't even know whether she was beautiful or not until I thought about what she might think. Then the third thing, of course, is why does she want that? You know, what makes her think that's an improvement? And that kind of self-loathing, which is real, you know, when you don't have any support, made me, you know, think of that as a real subject for a book. Not some victim, but really how it works.
So that's Toni Morrison. There's so much to follow up on here. From when did you finally take off those contacts to the effect of Toni Morrison in your life?
So I finally took them off, I believe, around the time I locked my hair when I was a junior in college. And I remember a few years later reading The Bluest Eye for the first time. In many ways, I could not read about that little girl without thinking about myself, without thinking about that first time I put on these honey contacts, that I thought it was an improvement, that I thought I was handsome, and how long it took me to realize that I was actually more handsome without the orange eyes, as my friends would joke on me. And so I think, you know, obviously Toni Morrison, like meeting any sort of black writer living, has had a tremendous impact on my life, on my personal life, let alone my sort of literary life. And I think one of the ways in which she had an influence, even on me writing this book, even on me writing the colorism sort of chapter, was her constant sort of instructions to black writers to not write with the white critic on our shoulders, to not write with the white gaze in our minds. Because one of the things that it's difficult for us to write about is internalized racism. Because what we fear is going to happen is white racists are going to take that and see, we've been telling you you're the problem all along, right? And now you're finally admitting it. And so for me, I was like, let me get the white critic off my shoulder and write. This is a reality that people of color, particularly black people, are facing, and I wanted to speak to it.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion. We're talking to Ibram Kendi, the professor of history and international relations and founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. He is a National Book Award-winning author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And just before we go to break, you were not a well-known professor, assistant professor at the University of Florida. Can you describe the moment, the National Book Awards? Is this one of these like dinners where no one knows who gets it until your name is called?
Yes, yeah.
So did you have your speech all prepared?
Oh, no. So, yeah, I remember we had my wife and I, Sadiqa, we had a a hotel room near the venue, and we were about to walk out, and Sadiqa was like, "Have you written your speech? Where's your speech?" And I was like, "No, I didn't write the speech. I'm not going to win. What's the purpose of writing a speech?" And she insisted that I jot down those notes, and I jotted down some notes, and when I heard my name called, as the video shows, I was completely shocked. I was completely shocked and literally had to gather myself even before I spoke.
Our guest for the hour, Ibram X. Kendi, Professor of History and International Relations, founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, American University, National Book Award-winning author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. His book out today on his birthday, How to Be an Anti-Racist.